Welcome to our final installment of the second Sunday series for the 2021 year. My name is Juliette McGraw. I am the Community and Cultural Education Director for the Friends of the Ridgefield National Wildlife Refuge. I'm very pleased to introduce In Search of Our Grandmothers. Judy Bridges is our speaker today, and I'm more than pleased to offer this introduction. Judy's relationship with the Plankhouse has lasted over many years, as she is closely affiliated with two of the three tribes that I work closest with on the refuge, the Cowlitz Indian tribe and the Chinook Indian Nation. Judy also is a descendant of the Iroquois people. In addition to be affiliated with many of our nation's tribes, she is a beloved instructor in the indigenous urban community. So many of us have learned how to weave hats, mats, baskets, and other items because of her skilled tutorship. What many may not know is that some of these things Judy has had to do her own research to restore these things, and I've gotten the privilege of looking at her cedar shawl that is now in progress. We are so grateful, those of us in the community, and I think the broader part of the Pacific Northwest, for elders like Judy who are taking a deep knowledge and sharing it with our communities and making sure that these lifeways are not lost. So please welcome Judy Bridges, In Search of Our Grandmothers.
Klahaya, Nakanem Tawista Awia. What I just said is, hi, my name is Tawista Awia. The language is Chinook Wawa, or sometimes called Chinook jargon, and it was used by my 5 fur trading ancestors, their wives, and their descendants. The name Tawista Awia means woman swan in the Iroquois Seneca language. The name was given to me when I was adopted by Gowanase. The adoption ceremony happened years ago, shortly after I went in search of my ancestral grandmothers, my roots. So I am Turtle Clan. The Seneca are one of the 5 original tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy. One of my ancestors was Thomas Tawakon, and is listed in the early fur trade journals and records as Iroquois. Which tribe of the original 5 was he? What clan was he? That information is not recorded. My educated guess is that he was Mohawk. All of that being said, most of you know me as Judy Bridges, née St. Martin, a member of the Cowlitz Indian tribe, basket maker, and basket teacher. My father was Huey Frank St. Martin, and a member of the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakima Nation. My mother was Edith Allen. So Mom was primarily of European descent, though the family oral history says her grandmother, Laura Wilson, was native blood, something Mom denied. I had one brother, Michael St. Martin. Now, all of my family, my brother, my father, and my brother, rest in our family cemetery, the St. Martin Cemetery, located in Carson, Washington. I've been married to Bill Bridges for approximately 50 years. I have one daughter, Jennifer King, née Rish, who has given me 3 grandchildren, Kendall, Payton, and Cora. So yep, I am a grandmother myself. I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ridgefield National Wildlife Refuge and Juliette McGraw, their Community and Cultural Education Director, for asking me to participate in their second Sunday program. Okay. Today's program title is In Search of Our Grandmothers, but my title for the presentation might be something like, How did I end up here? I'm going to share with you some of my journey to this Chinook-style Plankhouse. Yes, you will meet along the way some of my ancestral grandmothers, native and non-native, and could we meet them without meeting my grandpas too? First, I'd like to ask you a question. What do you know about your ancestors? Do you wish that you'd ask more questions about them growing up? As I said, I asked myself, how did I end up here when about half of my life was dedicated to ballet? That story of how that happened and why it seems so surprising to me starts early in my life. As I tell you about my journey, I will mention some of the resources that happened to help me find out what I do know about my grandmothers, my great-grandmothers, my great-great-grandmothers, my great-great-great-grandmothers, and yes, my great-great-great-great-grandmother, Joseph Lucier. Perhaps those resources may help you find your grandmother's stories. My story begins almost exactly 9 months after the official end of World War II. My first home was at the time a new construction house on Oak Street near what is today the Tacoma Mall. I love that name, Oak Street, because I love trees. My brother's room and my room were in the attic of that little house up some very steep stairs. As I grew up, one of my favorite memories of the house was the view of Mount Rainier from my mom's bright yellow kitchen. Oh, but I also loved hanging upside down from the cherry tree in the backyard. I attended Edison Elementary School a few blocks away. One day I was sent home with an official form to fill out. The form was no doubt for the government to document the race of each of the students for funding purposes. You know the one. You've seen similar forms. They give you limited choices. Are you white, Native American, Asian, or black? You get the idea. At home, I showed it to Mom and asked, what do I put down? She turned kind of stiff, and her voice rose as she emphatically and authoritatively said, you put down white. Well, I was confused. Mom had fair skin with freckles, hazel eyes, and fine-textured brownish hair. But Dad was dark-skinned and with dark brown eyes and had a lot of coarse, thick black hair. Even at my young age, I knew that Dad was Indian. In fact, Dad was a Yakima. Can you see the strong difference in this happy photo of my parents taken shortly after they were married? Well, Mom's pronouncement that I was white solved that question in my mind for about 50 years of my life anyway. I was white. And that was that. Mother had decreed it so, and you didn't argue with Mother. Mom did all the right things in order for me to succeed. She signed me up for ballet at age 7. Ballet was my passion until I attended the Evergreen State College in the early 1990s. I had violin and viola lessons, great times with the Brownies and Girl Scouts, and YMCA swim lessons where I competed and learned aqua ballet. We went to the Methodist Church every Sunday, dressed in the best clothes that Mom could afford or make. Thanks, Mom. In the early 1950s, we moved to Olympia into a brand new house that Mom and Dad had built from scratch. It had bedrooms on the ground floor, was very modern, and located on a quiet dead-end street. The view out the front living room picture window was of the Olympia watershed. I spent many happy hours enjoying and exploring that wooded space. As I said, Dad was very handsome, a very handsome-looking man. He worked as a welder at the Olympia Brewing Company, where he experienced discrimination. But what you must know is that Dad didn't participate in any tribal activities or do anything remotely resembling a native life. Though he worked at the brewery, He and Mom were teetotalers. Dad didn't talk much about his family or his early years. There were no cultural or spiritual directions from him. He just was not interested in much more than sports and fishing. He had a very successful all-star athlete in his youth in school. Here is a photo of him looking very fierce. So what do you expect? I believed I was white. Dad was French and Indian, a fact that I did know. So maybe his Canadian French blood explained why Mom said I was white, eh? In my home, growing up, there was a practice of silence. Not a spiritual practice as in yoga meditation, but an uneasy silence of no one speaking to another member of the family. Certainly no one talked about our heritage. I envy those who did grow up with stories about their native families, their villages that they came from, etc. At meals, in the kitchen area, the radio was on, and we were shushed, so Dad didn't miss any of the plays of the games he listened to. Or worse, the TV in the living room was broadcasting a game, and we had to be quiet so he could hear that. Mom worked 8 to 5 as a clerk typist in the Washington state offices. Olympia is the state capital of Washington. She was hard-pressed to get all of the chores done so that she could work part-time to earn a little extra money to pay for my ballet lessons and music lessons for my brother and myself. She would take in sewing jobs, which she executed in the basement evenings and weekends. Sewing was a skill she learned as a girl from her mother, and which she insisted that I learn, though at the time I hated it. Nevertheless, I'm grateful. Mom's family, well, what I've learned from my research and what little my mother remembered was that my maternal grandmothers were mostly poor with limited education. They were deeply devoted Christians and indeed very capable women. I've been known to characterize them as little house on the prairie types. So my maternal grandmother and her husband owned a house in Stevenson, Washington. Mom said that though they were poor, she and her sisters had plenty to eat. Grandpa had chickens, fruit trees, and a garden on the property. He fished and he hunted, providing lots of foods for Grandma Ruby to can and preserve. However, Grandpa's lung health eventually forced them to move away from the damp Washington weather to Southern California, where the weather was drier. We visited them, and they visited us occasionally. Grandpa's family was originally from New York State. They moved west, like many did in the 19th century, though that story is lost in time. Eventually, they were some of the first non-native people to settle in what was to become the city of Beaverton, Oregon. If you ever travel on Allen Avenue in that city, you are traveling on the road that led to their family farm, a center of social activity for their church and community. The family is mentioned in the Beaverton 100th anniversary book, forgive my pronunciation, Chakipi, The Place of the Beaver, by Virginia Mapes. Mom kept a photo of her mother and father on her dressing table. Interestingly, I now have photos of most of my maternal grandmothers going back to about the Civil War era, which was about the time of the invention of the camera. My great-great-grandfather's name was Orrin Sweet Allen. His Civil War letters to his wife Frances and his family are transcribed and self-published in a 2001 by his descendant William Rockwell. The title of the book is Dear Frank, The War Years, 1862 to 1865. About the time that book was published, Mom and I were gifted photos of both great-great-grandfather Orrin Sweet and his wife Frances. And and Orrin called Frances Frank. That's the name, Dear Frank. We were delighted to see her. She looked so little and somewhat delicate. By the way, all of my ancestral grandmothers on both sides of the family were short in stature. So, how did I dream of being a ballerina when I only reached the height of 5'2"? Well, I did. However, when Mom and I saw the photo of her husband, Orrin Sweet, for the first time, we both were simultaneously stunned. Grandpa Orrin looked so much like my brother Michael, who had recently died. We couldn't believe our eyes. The pain of Michael's death, which had followed on a long life of deep mental illness, drifted back into our consciousness as we gazed at the photo. So when we recovered from the shock, there was a feeling of joy and privilege to see his image. He was strikingly handsome. They both were, at least until my brother, Mike, had tried to commit suicide. In his 20s, he doused himself with gasoline, running away from my dad, who slipped and fell, giving my brother time enough to strike a match. When I started my journey to learn more about the family, many photos were pulled from some squirreled away place in my parents' home and shown to me. I have inherited a huge archive of photos of my family, both sides, going back to the 19th century. Other objects emerged too, such as the pocket-sized Civil War diary of my maternal great-great-grandfather, Mark Jones. We also have a fabulous photo of him in his fraternity regalia, as you can see. He looks kind of trim and small too. He was from Virginia and his wife's name was Cynthia Olds, but we don't have a picture of her and we don't know much about her, which gives me genealogical trails to explore in the future. Surprisingly, none of these treasures were ever shared to me previously. Dad didn't give me much advice growing up, but he did say I should get as much education as I could. I followed his advice as best I could. Both he and Mom wanted me to get a college degree. There were long discussions about that in my senior year of high school. Finally, we decided that after I graduated, I would attend California Western University in San Diego. California Western University was affiliated with the Methodist Church. That appealed to my mom. More importantly to me, in fact, that I insisted if I was going to go to college, the school had to have a dance program. California Western University offered a ballet major, and that appealed to me. California Western University was also associated with the San Diego Ballet Company. That offered me a chance to move into a ballet company. By that time, I was good enough ballet dancer to be placed in their company classes. I continued to follow Dad's advice to get all the education I could. However, my education was interrupted. It did resume, the education that is, after I married, gave birth to my daughter, and divorced my first husband. all of which happened within a 3-year period. A few years later, I met and married Bill Bridges from Norfolk, Virginia, who was stationed at McCord Air Force Base. Bill was supportive of me continuing my college education. I was working 2 jobs, one of which was teaching dance. Yes, I still wanted that degree. I still wanted that degree. I continued to perform and teach dance during my adult life. Here's a picture of me dressed to perform in the first act of the Nutcracker. One day, I went to a performance of East Indian temple dancing performed by Ratna Roy. As a result, I fell madly in love with that art form. I learned that Ratna was teaching dance at the Evergreen State College and decided to sign up for her classes, but not to officially matriculate. I thought, I could finish my college work and get my degree. So I applied to enroll at Evergreen, but there was a problem. The admin's office refused my application. I always chuckle inwardly when I think about what happened next. At one of my meetings with Ratna, I told her about my problem. Ratna, the East Indian woman, marched me across campus from her office to Carol Manu's office, an American Indian. Carol was running the Native American reservation-based program at the Quinault Indian Reservation. That did the trick. With Carol's help, I was admitted to the college, but there was a catch. I had to drive to the Quinault Indian Reservation and take my college courses at Taholah. Further, I would have to stay in that program for 2 quarters. Little did I know how that moment when Ratna introduced me to Carol, how it would change my life. That next quarter, I started to drive 93 miles one way from Federal Way, where Bill and I were living, to Taholah. Luckily, I ride-shared with another student, and we shared a motel room together each time we went. My life changed directions. And this is a big but, at the time, I was asking myself, what kind of Indian am I? In an early interview with Carol, who now was my advisor, I told her how excited I was to be able to learn about being Indian. No, she said, that is not what this program is about. I was embarrassed. The the reservation-based program, a program she invented and introduced to Evergreen, brings college courses to the reservation for Native people who don't have the means to travel to college. Still, the question remained, what kind of Indian am I? Sure, Dad was a member of the Yakama tribe, but like Paul Harvey said in his radio program years ago, what was the rest of the story? For some reason, I thought there must be more to the story, and boy, was I right. One of the first things I did was to build a family tree. I started by asking my parents for information. My first tree fit on a piece of paper. But as I researched, my tree grew and grew until when I reached 1,000 names in my free genealogical software program, it crashed and I lost all of my work. However, Mom and Dad dug out of storage a paper prepared by Dad's cousin. It was a great outline of not only Dad's family's names, but some of their stories too. Score! Another treasure. I double-checked that outline. Every detail had a primary source associated with it. It was all verifiable. That outline and my further research revealed that Dad's family was part of the early Pacific Northwest history. Why had he never talked about that? But before I go on, I want to tell you that as I finished my years at Evergreen, I became aware that my dancer's body was wearing out. My right hip was beginning to hurt. Some of you may know that after 25 years later, that is, I recently had my right hip totally replaced. Nevertheless, I loved the East Indian dance form so much that I did consider going to India to study with master teachers. Another evergreen teacher and I began to explore traveling to India to do just that. However, as I considered the downside of going, like leaving my husband for a period of time, the living conditions in India, but most of all, my right hip pain, they all argued against the trip in my mind. What outcome could I expect? Was I going to teach East Indian dance when I returned? Finally, I said no to my dancer self. I decided not to go. Ratna had choreographed an original dance production titled The Warrior Queen. She brought over musicians from India to play for us. We took it on tour. We took the Warrior Queen on tour, performing it not only at Evergreen, but also at the University of Washington and Washington State University. That was my last dance performance. It was the end of my dance career. It was the end of what I called being foolish over 50. I stopped dancing cold turkey. One of my intentions in attending Evergreen was to find something that I could feel as passionately about as I did about dancing. What I found through my Native American studies was just that, a new consuming path. I graduated from Evergreen with an emphasis in research and fictional writing. Here is a photo of me accepting my degree. I wore my cap, but took the green robe off. I wanted everyone to know that a Native American woman was graduating. As I was to learn, my dad's family history was fascinating. What I already knew from childhood was that my dad's grandfather, Isidore, and his grandmother, Marguerite, built around the turn of the century the St. Martin Hotel and Hot Springs business in Carson, Washington. Here's a photo of my great-great-grandmother, Marguerite, Arquette, St. Martin, and a photo of the Hotel St. Martin circa 1905, shortly after its completion. As a child, our family visited the hot springs and bathed in the mineralized water and visited family still living in the area, but only occasionally. The St. Martin Hotel and Hot Springs was one of the first Indian-owned and operated businesses in Washington. Both Isidore and Marguerite were Indian, half-breeds to some, though Isidore's red hair, beard were deceiving of the fact. Dramatic moment here. Little bit of history. Isidore was murdered, stabbed to death in 1910. My dad's mom and dad, Luch and Selena, died in the 1930s, long before I was a twinkle in my dad's eyes. Unfortunately, for my journey, I could not interview them either. How could I get any of my questions answered about their lives? Or my parent or dad's parents' lives, or any of the family history? I didn't feel I could ask Dad about his sad family history. Oh, did I mention? Dad went to Chemawa Indian School. He was 10 years old when his mother enrolled him. Chemawa boarding school is probably why Dad took no interest in his Native heritage. It was a terrible time in his life. Mom was cautious about us children, my brother and I, spending much time with the remaining family St. Martin members. Unfortunately, my dad's brother, like his father, had a drinking problem. Dad loved his father so much. Here's a photo of the two of them when Dad was young. I did interview some of the family elders. They had some interesting stories to tell. I traveled to our family cemetery and other cemeteries to view graves. I only caution you, I had a frightening experience visiting in the New Carson Cemetery as I viewed the grave of one of Dad's dreadful aunts. Supernatural things can happen. I traveled to the Northwest Room at the Tacoma Library and to the University of Washington to learn about Native American history. I visited the National Archives in Seattle to look into the Chemawa Indian School records of my father's family. He was not the only member of the family who attended Chemawa. The file folders were empty, except for my dad's. I immediately copied what I found in his folder, but it was a sad story. One of my most important research resources was and is a series of books titled The Catholic Church Records of the Pacific Northwest. These official records of the Catholic priests that came west at the request of my family and other retired fur traders were originally written in French. They were compiled by Harriet Munich. The French was translated by Michael Warner. Within the pages of these books, I found the records of my ancestors' baptisms, marriages, and burials. I own 3 volumes of these records: the Vancouver volume, the St. Paul volume, and the St. Louis volume. My 5 fur trading grandfathers worked for the Hudson's Bay Company, and their Pacific Northwest headquarters was at Fort Vancouver. When they retired from the Hudson's Bay Company, most of them settled in the Willamette Valley. Today, I still reference these volumes. For instance, for this presentation, I noticed for the first time that my great-grandmother, Marguerite, was listed only as Chinook in both her baptism and marriage records. However, in the index of the Vancouver volume, great-grandmother is listed as Chinook Marguerite Clackalam. Okay, what is with this Clackalam name? In other places, she is listed as Chamawash Marguerite Wapont. Confusing. You bet. Even today, in talking to our family genealogist, my double cousin Janice Citron, we are still trying to figure out those other names. What, if anything, is the significance of those names? Inquiring minds want to know. A word here. A word here about how the Catholic priests recorded the names of the native wives of fur traders. They would give them new first names, typically names from the Bible, like Elizabeth, Sarah, Mary, even Judith. For their new last names, they were given their tribal identity, such as Chinook or Cowlitz. Thus, whatever my grandmother's native names were, they did not come down to me in time. Nevertheless, I am grateful to know their tribal affiliation. Looking on the internet, you will find great Marguerite Chinook listed as the daughter of Chief Casino. Chief Casino, a name which was spelled various ways, was a Chinookan leader during the fur trade era in the Wapato Valley, today known as the Portland Basin. I have not found any historical record, any primary source material that substantiates that my Marguerite Chinook was Casino's daughter. The internet and the genealogical sites online can be a helpful source for researching ancestral grandmothers, but I am always suspicious of statements found there. They may or may not be right or true. By the way, At first, most of my research was done before the internet. Going back further in time, I'd like to tell you about my great-great-grandfather's mother, Catherine. According to the Catholic Church records, she was the daughter of Thomas the Wakan, an Iroquois man who worked in the fur trade and arrived in the Pacific Northwest about 1818. Catherine was the daughter of his country wife, who, according to the Catholic Church records, was Chinook. A country wife is a fur trader's First Nation, read Native American, or Métis, read mixed blood, common law wife. After all, when the Catholic grandfathers came west, there were only Native American women to take to wife, and there were no Catholic priests to bless their unions until late 1838. Catherine had a child with a Hudson's Bay Company sailor from England named Thomas Davis. He evidently left her and the child with no intention of returning. He may have passed her on to another man, a common practice at that time. Anyhow, Catherine became the wife of Andre St. Martin, who had recently arrived at Fort Vancouver from Sorel, Canada. As the Catholic priests had not arrived yet, Andre did something unusual for a Catholic. He married Catherine in a Protestant ceremony officiated by Reverend Beaver. In a second ceremony, several months later, the two were married in a Catholic ceremony. From Fort Vancouver, where he lived for a time next to Catherine's cousin White Wing, who had also married a Hudson's Bay Company sailor, Andre was transferred to Fort Nisqually and then on to the Cowlitz grazing farm near present-day Toledo. Catherine is special to me, as she is the only Native American grandmother whose native name I do know. It is Tameya. I do not know the translation of her name or even what language it is. To research Catherine, I joined the Sons and Daughters of Oregon Pioneers and the Daughters of the Pioneers of Washington. At one of their meetings held in Vancouver, Washington, I heard that one of their members was associated with my Catherine. In addition, I learned that about a book called White Wing, Princess of the Columbia Gorge by Lorraine Coswells, copyright 1997. In that book, the descendants of White Wing recorded their oral history. White Wing was the daughter of Chief Shlihush of Washougal, Wapato Island, and Multnomah Falls. Seems like that family talked about their native ancestors, unlike my family. In that book, my Catherine was a cousin to White Wing. Again, inquiring mind wants to know, was she a cousin on her mother's side or her father's side? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, but I'd like to. About 2004, I met a descendant of White Wing, Dorothy Landine. We became good friends. Through her, I've learned many stories about White Wing's family, my family, right? For instance, the name of White Wing's parents, the name of her brother, who was a headman at the village near Bonneville, and that one of them was a signer of the Grand Round Indian Treaty. My distant relatives, again, part of the early Pacific Northwest history. So, pardon me, I have told you about some of my grandmothers, maternal and paternal. Now I'm going to tell you about the one that is, for me, the most intriguing, Josephette. Sorry, I used to call her that. Her name is Joseph. I looked it up. That's the way you're supposed to say it. Of whom I had and still have so many questions. Joseph was my great-great-great-great-grandmother. She was married to Etienne Lucier. He was hired at Mackinac in 1810 to work for John Jacob Astor's Pacific Fur Company. After a horrific struggle across relatively unknown territory, as part of the Hunt Overland Party, he arrived at Fort Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia River in January 1812. He traversed the country by canoe, paddling, portaging, and pulling a canoe. He may have rode a horse partway, and he surely walked a good bit of it. In his marriage record, conducted by F.M. Blanchette, priest, performed at the Catholic Mission of the Willamette in January 1839, Etienne is said to be from Saint Edward, District of Montreal in Canada. Joseph is listed as Nweedi by nation. Their legitimate children were Felicity, aged 25 years, Adrian, aged 15 years, Pelage, aged 12 years, Louison, aged 7, Michael, aged 4, and Joseph, aged 6 months. When I first read this record, I was astounded and confused. You will remember that the priest assigned the native wives new names, and the last name indicated their tribal affiliation. I knew of no Indian tribe named Nweed, nor did I find one. I did find a Nweedi village on a map located at the northern end of Vancouver Island. Was she from there? My husband and I spent 5 successive summers trying to reach that village. It was and still is very remote. I finally did go there via Google Earth. Getting back to the records, I learned that the priest stayed 6 months at Etienne's cabin after they arrived in the West. I've got to trust that they knew Joseph's story. I did the math, and their first child was born about 1814. So Joseph was about 14 years old when she gave birth to Felicity. She might have been impregnated when she was 13 years old. Felicity was born circa 1814, and their second child, my great-great-great-grandmother, Adrian, wasn't born for almost 10 years later. Yeah, what's up with that? Very intriguing. Joseph's baptismal record stated that she was 40 years old in January 1839. So that last baby arrived when she was 39 years old. Her birth year was then approximately 1799. So she lived about 4 decades. 4 is the sacred number of the Kwakiutl Indian people, her people. I purchased a rare book, The Oregon Country Under the Union Jack, and other books about Astoria. In one of them I read that the gentlemen of Astor's company, who were literate and kept journals, called the people from Vancouver Island Nweedi. Much later I read that there was a village named Nweedi on Templar Channel of the Clayoquot Sound, right in Nootka territory. Was Joseph Nootka? The village of at the northern end of Vancouver Island was a Kwakiutl village. She was Kwakiutl, right? Or was she? The Nootka Indians from Vancouver Island traded with the Chinook Indians and other Indians along the river systems of what was to become Washington State. The Chinook canoes were called Nootka canoes, for instance. They also traded in tilia, or shell money, and slaves. Was Josephette a slave? She so fascinated me, and still does. So many questions. What was her native name? How did she become the wife of a French Canadian at the mouth of the Columbia River? Did she have a flattened head, which would have indicated her status in her community? Why did she wait so long between babies? Did she abort any children, as was the practice of some Chinook women? Her spirit asked me to tell her story. So I started writing a historical fiction about her. I consulted a trusted publisher friend who was also a psychic. I paid her to do a reading for me. Wow! I was not disappointed. I received so many details. Every time I read that transcript, I cry. Interestingly, at a Cowlitz ceremonial gathering in this house, pre-COVID, Mike I.L. said that his ancestor took one or more wives from Vancouver Island back in my great-great-great-great-grandmother's time. Women were used, as they always have been, for various reasons or purposes. For instance, to cement trade partnerships. Native people often gave them to their enemies to ease the pain of war losses. By the way, the Newidi people were credited to having caused the destruction of John Jacob Astor's ship, the Tonquin, in the summer of 1811. Could her family have traded her out of guilt for the loss of the Tonquin? Or maybe she could have been traded for something as simple and tried as and desirable as a rifle. I don't know. I worked on her story off and on for many years. One year, I got the wind knocked out of my sails, novel-wise. I was well along writing her story when my first cousin, Dennis Clyde, a DNA expert, sent me an email saying that his wife, a direct female descendant of Joseph, through women, had a rare DNA marker, and there was a person who shared that rare marker who lived in the area of the Broken Island group of Vancouver Island. Whew, that was a long sentence. That was Nootka territory, not Kwakiutl territory. Did I start all over writing her story? I would need to research the Nootka culture and lifestyle. I'd already written that Joseph was Kwakiutl, and what was I to do? I stopped writing the story altogether. I was so discouraged. Years later, I figured out a fix for that problem. Stay tuned. By the way, Joseph was the first adult woman to be buried in the newly consecrated Catholic St. Paul Cemetery, what is called the Old Cemetery. Her marker, as well as other relatives buried there, ancestors, anyway. Her name and the other names of those buried there are written on a long memorial wall at the back of the cemetery. By the way, it is recorded that Joseph was short. Native women were not tall, so she must have been unusually short. Her daughter Adrienne, pictured here with her husband, Andre Lachapelle, is a woman of some beauty, I think. Perhaps Joseph became Etienne's wife because of her exceptional beauty. Adrienne, who married Andre Lachapelle, was my great-great-great-grandmother. She was known as a midwife to many of the pioneer women. The research for my novel and for my family tree is ongoing. Perhaps one day I will even finish the novel. Stay tuned. Okay, that finishes my presentation. I hope you learned a few interesting facts and been inspired to start your own research journey. I wish you well. Klahaya. Oh, by the way, Klahaya means goodbye, as well as hello. Klahaya.
Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this year's Cathlapotle Plankhouse Second Sunday series. A big hayumasi to Judy Bridges for wrapping up the series with In Search of Our Grandmothers. However, we want to make sure we thank everyone that was on the table for this series this year. Specifically, we want to thank the Fish and Wildlife Service for their trail tips and support of the series. All of our presenters this year, side for one, were Indigenous. We were able to represent over 12 different nations in the series this year. And the one non-Indigenous presenter has had a deep, fulfilling relationship with the Plankhouse since before my time. Of course, you've seen me in front of the cameras. However, I want to make sure we acknowledge everybody who works behind the scenes. Above and beyond the call of duty has been Samantha Ziner, our administrative coordinator, who has walked me through many technical issues, and our advice that we've gotten from Mauricio Valadrian, the creative director for Valadrian Creative. I welcome feedback, so you can reach me, Juliet McGraw, the community and cultural director for the Friends of the Ridgefield National Wildlife Refuge, at Cathlapotle Plankhouse at ridgefieldfriends.org. Feel free to drop me a line if you have any questions about the series or suggestions for future offerings. Thank you, and we will see you in the future.